There we go. I never know if it's turned on. Thank you and welcome everyone this evening again to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, the New South Wales Association. Great to see so many of you here this evening. We have, of course, the Honourable Julie Bishop, who is the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade with us this evening. So we're very honoured to have Julie with us. Just before we get underway, I'll just run through a few of the housekeeping items. I know I do this every week, but it is important for our new guests that we have here. Julie will talk, and then after that we will take Q&A. So I'll get up and then I'll invite questions from the audience. Please refrain from making statements and just ask a question if you can. When you stand up, if you'd like to just introduce yourself as well, that would be great. I'd also like to welcome a number of dignitaries we have here this evening, the US Consul General, the Indian Consul General and the Russian Consul General, as well as Dick Woolcott, who's also a long supporter of the Institute. So I welcome those people here this evening and thank you for coming. So we may as well get underway straight away. Julie.
Distinguished guests, members, ladies and gentlemen. In 2002, Zimbabwe held a presidential election. Under the Mugabe regime, the campaign was marred by violence, corruption and vote rigging. Mugabe's gangs of so-called war veterans terrorised white farmers and occupied their land. The international community feared Mugabe would unleash the armed forces on the civilian population and the election would turn into a bloodbath. My friend and colleague, Alexander Downer, decided to send me over there to be part of a Commonwealth Electoral Observer mission. Character building, he suggested. So there I found myself, late one afternoon, with one other observer from Jamaica and a guide, deep in the remote Chimanimani Mountains on the Mozambique border, inspecting the ruins of a farmhouse of a white farmer trashed by these thugs. Now, I didn't feel I would be doing my job if I didn't attempt to make contact with them. So picture the scene. The war veterans had set up camp on the top of the hill. It was approaching dusk and a group of about 20 men were sitting around a campfire, guns and wild dogs in equal number. On reaching the camp, my knees began to shake, but I managed to say, rather perkily, "I'm from the Commonwealth Observer Mission, here to find out whether the coming election will be free and fair." The leader of the gang, whom I later learned was called the Leopard, draped in bike chains, looked me up and down and leered menacingly. He had no teeth. "You British?" Now, I knew enough of colonial history to say no, and then somewhat hesitantly said, "Actually, I'm Australian." There was silence. Looks were exchanged across the group. Then, after what seemed an age, the Leopard said, "Australia? Do you know Shane Warne?" If only I had a text message from Shane to prove it. They accepted my assurance that of course I knew Shane Warne, and then followed a harrowing few minutes as I feared that my limited cricket knowledge would be exposed. We parted on polite terms and with their best wishes to Warnie. Now, the point of that story is that in international and cross-cultural relations, we must strive to establish a point of common interest, however slender, upon which a stronger relationship can flourish. This applies at a national as well as a personal level as countries seek to pursue what they perceive to be their national interest. Tonight, I will speak on the Coalition's foreign policy principles, for we have a long-standing record of a pragmatic approach to foreign policy that seeks to enhance our security and prosperity, maintain or expand our bilateral and regional relationships, and project Australia and our values into our region and beyond. These are fundamental pillars. While significant aspects of Australian foreign policy are bipartisan, such as the war in Afghanistan or the threat posed by nuclear proliferation, tonight I will touch on areas where there are obvious differences from the government's approach. I'll also touch on a number of specific foreign policy challenges, including the China-US relationship and our relationships with Indonesia, India and Papua New Guinea. I'll not be able to cover all of the issues that make up the foreign policy picture, and of course our detailed policy will be released closer to an election whenever that exciting prospect may eventuate. In another time and place, President John F. Kennedy said in September of 1963 that the purpose of foreign policy is not to provide an outlet for our own sentiments of hope or indignation. It is to shape real events in a real world. At that time, the United States was troubled by the rise of the Soviet Union and the growing strength of Communist China. Kennedy reasoned that promoting democracy throughout the world was not being done to impose US values on inferior peoples, but with a clear goal of supporting the independence of nations so that one bloc cannot gain sufficient power to finally overcome the United States and its allies. He highlighted the important role of foreign aid in building independence in other nations and pointed to the successful reconstruction of Germany and Japan after the war as key bulwarks against Soviet and Chinese expansion. In support of his arguments, he said, "For the most striking thing about our world in 1963 is the extent to which the tide of history has begun to flow in the direction of freedom." 50 years on, those words still ring true and can be applied to contemporary global challenges, indeed equally to the US and Allied engagement in Afghanistan or the response to the Arab Spring, particularly against Libya and its crackdown on the cry for freedom and democracy. The Liberal Party approaches matters of foreign affairs with a strong philosophical commitment to our party's parallel traditions of liberalism and conservatism. This philosophical framework stands at the heart of our party and shapes the way we relate to each other and to the world at large. As Prime Minister John Howard once noted, the Liberal Party is at its most dynamic when there is a strong and healthy interplay between those two great philosophical forces. At our core, as Liberal Party founder Robert Menzies stated, is the freedom to worship, to think, to speak, to choose, to be ambitious, to be independent, to be industrious, to acquire skills, to seek reward. These are the real freedoms, for these are the essence of the nature of man. We believe that these values mirror the views of the Australian population and reflect the aspirations of many people throughout the world. On an international level, these values translate into a belief in the sanctity of human rights and freedoms, the rule of law, and democracy as a preeminent form of government. Accepting the pluralistic nature of the international system doesn't mean losing sight of the values we as a party hold dear. It is a matter of seeking to build like-minded communities within our region to strengthen our position and that of our allies while respecting our differences. Recognising the philosophical foundations on which our party is based is an important step in understanding the Coalition's foreign affairs priorities. We believe that the purpose of Australian foreign and trade policy is to advance our national interest, the security and prosperity of Australia and Australians. We believe that the task of Australia's foreign and trade policy is to advocate and advance the national interest in a way which is both effective and in accord with the values of the Australian people. These are comforting rather than inspirational ideals, yet these are serious words. I do not believe that the present government has done a good job in pursuing the task of foreign and trade policy, as I will indicate shortly. Australia's close relationship with the United States is the cornerstone of our foreign and security policies and a significant factor in our broader engagement with our region. The global primacy of the United States has underwritten our regional security and prosperity and helped ensure that global goods such as freedom of the seas has been maintained. Suggestions that the United States quietly surrender its primacy in Asia, which has been proposed here in Australia chiefly by ANU academic and former Labor advisor Hugh White, should concern all nations which have prospered under the current system of international rules and norms. Australia stands alongside other countries in the region in our commitment to continued US engagement and leadership in Asia. In this context, it is important to note that in order to form government, the Australian Labor Party entered a formal written alliance with the Australian Greens. The Greens oppose the fundamentals of Australian foreign policy that have been implemented by all governments for decades. Specifically, the Greens seek the end of the ANZUS alliance, to close all existing foreign bases on our territory, the end of the bilateral free trade agreements, including the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement, our withdrawal from the WTO, the IMF and the World Bank, and that is just for starters. If these published policies were taken up by the Gillard government in any way, they would represent the biggest single threat to Australian international security arrangements, as it would mean the abandonment of all major security links with the United States. Recalling that before our alliance with the United States, we depended on the British security umbrella, this would turn on its head 110 years of Australian defence and security policy. Despite their rhetoric and continual claims to the high moral ground, the Greens' policies are a genuine risk to the peace, security and economic welfare of Australia, and given that they are dictating Labor government policy in many other areas. But enough of the Greens. In regard to Australia's relationship with the emerging power in the Asia-Pacific, namely China, the Coalition will return to a policy based on shared interest and mutual respect. China is a critical player in world affairs, and there are few greater global challenges than the re-emergence of China as a superpower. Given our regional and economic proximity, how Australia manages shifts in global economic power will have profound implications for Australia's domestic and foreign policy making. I note that for the first time in living memory, our major trading partner is not one of our major strategic allies. However, I reject the notion that Australia must choose between its economic and strategic interests. China's increasing economic, political and strategic prominence presents opportunities and challenges for our two countries. The Coalition believes that it is essential that Australia-China relations remain a strong and consistent partnership based on shared interests and mutual respect. We will continue to voice our concerns over issues where we disagree or where we believe go against the values held by our party and the majority of Australians. In the end, however, it will be patient diplomacy, not public hectoring, that will achieve real results. I sincerely hope that we can assist the Chinese leadership to understand the enormous benefits to their country of a more open and transparent form of government that matches their more open and competitive approach to markets. Last year, Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd argued that Australia should have a new third way approach in relation to China that avoids the extremes of conflict and kowtowing, as he put it. This is a classic straw man argument, and it is not apparent that any self-respecting nation, and certainly not Australia, has adopted either of these extreme foreign policy positions. The fact is that we need no new third way. Instead, what we need is a return to the firm, quiet diplomacy provided by the Howard-Downer partnership over nearly 12 years. That pragmatic policy represents a more realistic third way, if such a label is required. The Rudd government's Defence White Paper of 2009 left no doubt that Australia's defence planning is primarily motivated by the re-emergence of China on the international stage. The issue of the White Paper has been raised directly with me in Beijing, as the tacit identification of China as a potential military threat to Australia in that document caused deep concern at the time. I don't agree with all the assumptions or assessments in the white paper, but it does highlight the need for China to show greater transparency with regard to its military build-up and its long-term goals. However, the Coalition doesn't share the view that conflict with China is inevitable, and to do so runs the risk of imagining conflicts that are not there. However, the heightened sense of strategic vulnerability already felt in the region has been exacerbated in recent times by the actions of the Chinese government. When China declared last year its indisputable sovereignty over the South China Sea, it brought a swift repudiation from the United States and caused considerable concern throughout the region, particularly in countries with competing territorial claims. This announcement placed the South China Sea, a vital sea lane for Japan, South Korea and the United States, among others, alongside Taiwan and Tibet in the minds of the Chinese government as an indisputable part of Chinese territory and a core national interest. This issue is still causing considerable tension in the region, and we urge all parties to find a peaceful resolution. When last in government, the Coalition developed a deeper mutual understanding with China than at any other time in our history, and without jeopardising our close and enduring friendship with the United States. In doing so, Australia achieved a balance between our strategic and economic interests that was the envy of many countries. It is an undeniable truth that the Coalition puts greater priority on bilateral and regional relationships than does the Labor Party, which clearly puts greater faith in multilateral institutions than we do. That does not mean that we think multilateral institutions are insignificant and unimportant. For example, our objection to Labor's campaign to win a temporary seat on the United Nations Security Council in 2013 is based on a realistic assessment of its chances of success and an appreciation of the massive diplomatic effort this demands, at a possible cost to taxpayers of well in excess of $50 million at the very least, which has diverted attention away from our core foreign policy interests and from our region to more peripheral issues and areas in order to secure votes. The Coalition has, I believe, a more grounded, pragmatic understanding of the real world. The fact that an entity is multilateral does not invest it with any greater wisdom or moral superiority. Thus, under a Coalition government, we would place a higher priority on ensuring good bilateral relationships, for example in trade policy. We will vigorously pursue high-quality, comprehensive free trade agreements with China, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, South Korea, as well as across the Pacific Islands. The negotiations for these agreements have effectively stalled, and this is having consequences. Australia and New Zealand both commenced free trade agreement negotiations with China in 2005. New Zealand concluded their agreement in 2008, while there has been virtually no progress under Labor for the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement. This puts us at a competitive disadvantage with New Zealand. Take our rock lobsters. Australian seafood producers face tariffs of between 10 and 15%. New Zealand producers will have zero tariffs from 2012 under their free trade agreement with China. Meanwhile, South Korea has negotiated a free trade agreement with the European Union and is advanced in negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States. Given the size of the Korean beef market for Australian producers, they are very concerned about key competitors gaining an advantage. It is also fair to say that some of our important bilateral relations are in need of serious attention. The most recent example being the failures in dealing with Indonesia over the live cattle export issue. Sadly, in what has become an increasingly familiar pattern with this government, the decision to impose a total ban on this trade to Indonesia was made without any warning or consultation with the Indonesian government. We cannot afford to treat Indonesia so shabbily. It should be one of our most important and strategic relationships. Indonesia has undergone a remarkable transformation in recent years, with economic development matched by political reforms which have granted greater levels of freedom and opportunity to its people. Indonesia has benefited from a decade of sustained economic growth and is now a highly valued member of the G20. Should Indonesia achieve its growth targets, it will become the world's 10th largest economy by 2015. It is one of our closest neighbours, but the relationship is yet to mature. Strengthening Australia's relationship with Indonesia will be a core task for a coalition government. India is another case in point. Strengthening Australia's strategic and economic relationship with India is a priority. India and Australia are natural partners. It is essential that this relationship be broadened and deepened if it is to withstand the type of challenges that have arisen in recent years. The Coalition has committed to lift the ban on the sale of Australian uranium to India with appropriate safeguards. India has an excellent record of non-proliferation and has agreements with the United States, Canada, France, Argentina and others for the supply of nuclear fuel and technology. I was recently in Hyderabad, and from my discussions with Indian Commerce Minister Sharma, it is apparent that Labor's ideological stand on this issue is preventing Australia and India from developing a closer strategic engagement. The deep irony, of course, is that if the government was serious about reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, helping India to provide low emissions baseload nuclear energy is one of the most practical and concrete steps Australia could take. Globalisation and the democratisation of information technology have resulted in increased pressure on world leaders to address human rights concerns and abuses in other parts of the world. What was called the CNN effect is now the Facebook or Twitter effect, as information once closed off to citizens in certain countries is now readily available via the internet. As we have seen in the Middle East and North Africa in recent months, the universal human desire for greater freedom cannot be suppressed indefinitely. A coalition government will pursue a principled and robust approach to human rights abuses, particularly in our region. Australians have the right and expectation that their national leaders give voice to their concerns when conducting Australian foreign policy. We will work with countries in our region to establish more ministerial-level human rights dialogues where issues of human rights can be discussed in an open and frank forum. Indeed, the Howard government was successful in negotiating a ministerial-level human rights dialogue with China, and Australia remains the only nation with which China has such a dialogue at that level. In the last election, I announced initiatives to boost the participation of women in regional forums and generally in leadership positions in the region, and I have met with women leaders and members of Parliament in the Asia Pacific to further this initiative. The Coalition will pursue greater international student exchange, and while we will seek to restore our position as a destination of choice for overseas students, we will encourage more Australian students to take up opportunities to live and study abroad. I've also proposed that the Coalition make the teaching of foreign languages here in Australia a priority so that our people better understand foreign countries and cultures and can more readily interact at an international level. I have been critical of the government's failure to focus sufficient attention on our immediate region. A feature of coalition policy will be our renewed efforts in enhancing relations in our neighbourhood, and that will include countries in the Indian Ocean Rim, as Australia should look west as well as east. Our relationship with Papua New Guinea will also be a key coalition priority. Central to this will be the resetting of the relationship based on an economic partnership rather than aid donor and recipient. Papua New Guinea has an opportunity to take long strides down the path of economic and social development through the benefits expected to be gained from a number of massive resource projects currently underway. The first LNG project in the Southern Highlands has the potential alone to double the size of the PNG economy within the decade. Australia must partner PNG to help realise its immense potential rather than act only as its major aid donor, and work with Papua New Guinea to ensure that it can transition to self-sufficiency away from aid dependency. I must also mention Fiji, as it has been the subject of sanctions from Australia, New Zealand and other like-minded countries like the United States and the members of the European Union since the military coup by Commodore Frank Bainimarama in 2006. Fiji has been evicted from the Commonwealth of Nations and the Pacific Island Forum. However, there are reports that our government has privately expressed concerns that the sanctions regime is not working. There is a concern that instead of leading to democracy, the sanctions regime may in fact be leading the Bainimarama administration into more authoritarian ways. It appears that the present strategy is not working. The government's insistence on using only sanctions will potentially drive a wedge between Australia and our closest allies, the United States, New Zealand and Japan, who have now conceded that a new approach is needed. The Coalition believes that it is time for the Australian government to review its stance on Fiji. On coming to government, the Coalition will review the effectiveness of the sanctions regime. This is important if elections in Fiji are to be held by 2014 at the very latest, and for there to be a return to democracy and the rule of law in Fiji. This doesn't mean the Coalition will necessarily weaken the current sanctions regime. However, we will enter into dialogue with the regime to find a way forward for the Fijian people. One area where Australians are trusted and seen as genuine regional and global leaders is in sport. And I believe there's immense untapped potential for our foreign policy objectives. Now, I've already acknowledged Shane Warne as a global ambassador, but I was struck by the almost religious fervour that attaches to Australian Rugby League in Papua New Guinea. For a country with over 800 different languages, beset by tribal conflict, village against village, the state of origin unites the country like no other force: political, economic, social, cultural. Queensland Rugby League players are heroes. Mal Meninga would be elected national leader by acclamation. And Fijians tell me that the issue that most concerns the Fijian regime is the travel ban that prevents regime members watching or playing in overseas sporting competitions. So, as far as I'm concerned, there will have to be a dedicated sport, diplomacy and development policy somewhere in the foreign affairs portfolio. And that brings me to the issue of foreign aid. It should not only be about alleviating poverty, it should also be about promoting our national interest, which includes supporting nations in our region to become self-sufficient, not aid-dependent. The Coalition's 2010 election policy on foreign affairs promised an independent inquiry into our aid budget and program. In response, after the election, Labor established an inquiry into the effectiveness of our aid budget. That inquiry, named the Independent Review of Aid Effectiveness, was recently released by the government. The stakes are high. To meet the commitment of 0.5% of gross national income, the current aid budget of $4 billion will have to be doubled to over $8 billion in 2015-2016. That will make foreign aid one of the largest spending programs in the federal budget. The aid review described that increase as steep and challenging. Recommendation 39 of the review states, the scale-up of the aid program to 0.5% of GNI should be subject to the progressive achievement of predetermined hurdles, and that failure to achieve a hurdle or fully achieve it must have consequences. For example, the government could reduce the rate of increase or withhold all or part of the funding unless and until the hurdle is achieved. In its response, the government failed to acknowledge the need for benchmarks or to define what they should be or how AusAid will be measured against them. We will insist on a more rigorous governance of the aid program. The Coalition will appoint a separate Minister for Overseas Development Assistance to oversight the aid budget to ensure that aid is delivered effectively and efficiently and is rigorously benchmarked against strict outcomes. The Coalition will also review the priorities within the existing aid budget to consolidate our aid efforts on the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean, where we can make the most difference, rather than spread it thinly across every continent. In conclusion, our approach to foreign policy is one of pragmatism and practicality, realism rather than idealism, seeing the world as it is rather than how we hope it is. We will seek to advance our national interests by enhancing our security and prosperity, focusing on our bilateral relationships and projecting Australia and our values, particularly into our region. I thank the Australian Institute of International Affairs for the opportunity to address you this evening.
Thank you, Julie, and to use one of your words, it's so wonderful to hear the opposition's foreign policy outlined so pragmatically this evening, and particularly I think with reference to our new neighbours in the Asia Pacific. The Honourable Leader of the Deputy Leader of the I keep saying leader, I mean perhaps that's something
Don't go there.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition is probably one of the most accessible members of Parliament that I have come across. But I just ask you tonight, no staring, please. If I can take questions from the audience, again, as I said, please refrain from comments and ask a question, and please state your name before you make that question. Yes, sir.
John Hearn, the University of Sydney. Thank you for a very clear statement. As a previous education minister, how would research and education be part of Australian diplomacy? And second, if I may squeeze another, what do you think, could you comment on a Prime Minister who says international is not her thing?
I'll start with the comment about the Prime Minister. I thought it was unfortunate that the Prime Minister chose an overseas forum to announce to a domestic audience back home that she would rather be in Australia listening to children read in a classroom than taking part in what was clearly an important international forum. It was clearly meant for a domestic audience, but it has certainly given the impression that the Prime Minister has no passion for international affairs and no particular interest in it. Fortunately for Australia, we have a very proactive Foreign Minister who has more than made up the vacuum. In relation to research and education, I see them as very important parts of our foreign policy initiatives. I touched briefly on the issue of international student exchanges. I happen to believe that one of the purest forms of diplomacy would be a world where a body of young people in one country had lived, worked, studied, learned and absorbed in another country. And to me, the opportunity for young people of Australia to live and work and study overseas is one that we should promote at every opportunity. Australia has had a strong reputation as a destination for international students. It has waned somewhat in recent times, and I would certainly make it a priority as a former education minister to ensure that we were again a destination of choice for international students. But I think it equally important that we encourage Australian students to study overseas. When I was Education Minister, I asked my department to carry out some research as to why it was that relatively few Australian students took the opportunity to conduct part or all of their higher education overseas, and the results of that survey were rather interesting. Unfortunately, they were given to me the day before the 2007 election, so I didn't ever have an opportunity to do anything with that research. But it was not financial reasons that prevented them from doing it, which is what I had assumed. It was that life in Australia is pretty good and they really didn't see it as a priority for them. So I would like to change that. Likewise, foreign languages. I think it's so important that we increase our focus on Australians having a second language or more. I'm always interested to hear people talk about the United States as being somewhat insular in its attitude to international affairs, yet the number of people in the United States who speak Spanish, for example, is quite significant because of Mexico on the southern border. Well, how many Australians speak Indonesian, which is on our northern border? So I think that that's an area where we could certainly make it a priority. As for research, again, an area of collaboration, finding our common shared interests. And we do have a number of research agreements with other countries, and I think it's a fine base upon which to build stronger relationships. I know with China, for example, we have a number of important research and scientific agreements in place, as we do with other countries. And once you can get those agreements in place and scientists working, researchers working at a researcher-to-researcher level, it augurs well for the overall relationship.
Thank you.
Richard.
Richard Bronowski, University of Sydney. Thanks very much for a very clear exposition of Liberal foreign policies, but I tried in vain to see many dramatic differences with the present government, and I found it hard to do so. You say we should be selling uranium to India. Your Prime Minister of the day, Malcolm Fraser, was the one who laid down a very clear definition that we would not sell uranium to any country not a member of the NPT. Two questions quickly. Firstly, if we sell to India, does this open a precedent for selling to other countries, and which ones would these be? Secondly, do you still favour, as I think you have in the past, having nuclear power in Australia?
I did say at the outset that foreign policy in Australia is largely bipartisan in a number of areas, and I would think that people would celebrate that fact, that when we project into the international community, generally foreign policy is a bipartisan issue. I have touched on some areas where we differ with the government, and it's not just a matter of nuance. In some instances it will translate into quite significant policy differences. Our focus on the region, our focus on bilateral relationships, our focus on free trade agreements compared with the government's focus more broadly and on multilateral relationships, and that translates into significant differences. Just to state it might not seem it, but most certainly when you dig deeper it does. In relation to India, the fact is India has a proven track record as a good citizen in nuclear non-proliferation. It is not a signatory to the treaty, but let's face it, that wasn't a problem for Labor when the Hawke government sold uranium to France before it became a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I think we should really call this for what it is. It's an internal dispute within the Labor Party, and yet it's affecting, I believe, our national interest. Essentially, India thinks we don't trust them with our uranium, and the coalition does trust them with it, given the kind of safeguards that would be put in place at a bilateral level and the international safeguards. No, it doesn't set a precedent, because of course you do it on a case-by-case basis, as we have in the past. We sell uranium to a number of countries, and we've clearly considered each one of them on their merits. Just because a country is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty doesn't mean that there shouldn't be concerns about what they do with uranium. But I believe that India has proven itself in that regard, and most certainly I'm comfortable that appropriate safeguards can be put in place. What concerns me is that we have lost a competitive opportunity, as countries such as Canada have now filled the need that India has. So maybe the opportunity has been lost. But I think at a deeper level it says a lot about how we regard India as a potential important strategic economic partner, and it's certainly a relationship that I intend to pursue at the highest level.
Hello, my name is Doreen. I'm from the Australian Town Congress. You touched on the human rights dialogue with countries concerned. My question in relation to the recent Channel 4 documentary that was aired on ABC called The Sri Lankan Killing Field, which clearly identified war crimes and crimes against humanity in the last days of the civil conflict in Sri Lanka. Some of the media reported that there were discussions in the coalition room after the footage was aired. Since then, US has banned aid to Sri Lanka, and there's been ICG reports, and the UN expert panel had said their internal mechanism called the Lessons Learned Reconciliation Committee lacks some credibility, independence and judicial power to implement anything. What would be the coalition policy in upholding human rights values and human rights in Sri Lanka? And just interested to know the policy and if you would support an independent investigation into war crime allegations and all parties concerned in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
The coalition clearly believes that where war crimes have occurred, they should be uncovered, they should be investigated, and if people have committed them or have been accused of committing them, then prosecutions should follow. So obviously we have a strong commitment to that, and we were one of the signatories to the International Criminal Court to pursue war crimes and crimes against humanity. In relation to the civil war that raged in Sri Lanka, that program showed some horrific footage and was quite distressing to view. I note that the United Nations has indicated that the Sri Lankan government should conduct an independent inquiry, and that it has sought to do so. Now, whether or not it is independent in the sense that we would accept, I'm assuming that the United Nations will continue to monitor that. If the United Nations Security Council, for example, believes that the Sri Lankan government has not conducted an appropriate review, then it's open to the UN Security Council to seek to do so. We clearly believe that it's in the interests of all people in Sri Lanka for there to be a peaceful resolution to the civil conflict, that any instances of war crimes or abuses of human rights should be uncovered, and we will monitor very closely to see if the Sri Lankan government is able to conduct its inquiry with that outcome in mind. So we're closely monitoring it. I've spoken on Sri Lanka in the Parliament on a number of occasions, and we would certainly support an inquiry if it were found, an independent inquiry if it were found that the Sri Lankan government hadn't done the task that it should have.
How should Australia proceed should Kuwait be right in saying that, you have to choose between our strategic and economic allies, say namely China and the USA, especially in the global context of massive disparities in standard of living, climate change and resource depletion?
I don't believe that it will come down to that, and I certainly don't believe that the United States or China believe that it's going to be a question of asking countries to choose between the United States and China. I believe that the United States and China see it in their respective interests for it to be a strong relationship. And my understanding is that much has been done in that regard. There's now much more engagement and discussion between the United States and China on defence issues, for example. And there's obviously points of considerable difference, but I think that we're seeing greater engagement between the two countries that recognises that conflict at any level is not in either of their interests or the interests of their allies. I think we should be encouraging both the United States and China to work together to solve some of the problems in the region. North Korea, the problems on the Korean Peninsula, for example. The United States, I hope, will be a force for good in resolving the issue over the South China Seas. So I don't subscribe to Hugh White's theory, and I think that Australia is able to balance its respective relationships between the United States and China without being forced to or having to choose between the two.
Brian.
Brian Everingham, you mentioned the resource development in Papua New Guinea as a key to its future. How will you and the government coalition help Papua New Guinea avoid the so-called resources trap?
Dutch disease.
Yeah.
Papua New Guinea has had a troubled history in mining and resource development. The Ok Tedi mine, for example, the Bougainville copper mine, and that still hasn't been resolved. But I believe that they have learned the harsh lessons from those previous years. The challenge, of course, is to ensure that the significant inflows of foreign capital that will inevitably come as a result of the development of this LNG project and the others in the pipeline don't create the symptoms of Dutch disease and have that currency appreciation and then the problem with exports and imports and the non-mining sector being totally overwhelmed, as has happened in the past. It will come down to strict governance applying to the sovereign wealth funds that I understand PNG is seeking to set up. In this regard, Australia has played a role in providing advice. In fact, David Murray, the head of our Future Fund, has been to PNG and spoken to the Treasury and Bank of PNG working group that's been set up to look at options on how to manage the enormous capital inflows that are expected, and have provided advice on various options as to whether or not these funds should be offshore or onshore. And as I understand it, legislation is likely to be introduced into the PNG Parliament sometime this year, which will be the beginning of the establishment of 3 sovereign wealth funds, one called a sustainability fund, one an infrastructure fund, and a future savings fund for future generations. So as long as there are strict governance protocols around it, that these funds are enshrined in legislation and that they require an absolute majority in order for there to be any changes to that legislation, then I think that we're starting down the path of realising the immense potential that PNG has to be self-sufficient. Of course, it will take a considerable effort, and Australia should be seeking to partner PNG by offering our expertise, and also for future mining and resource projects. Australian mining and resource producers are amongst the best in the world. We have great technological know-how and expertise, and I think we can offer to work with PNG in developing their assets in a way that benefits their whole community. It is still one of the poorer countries in the world, yet its economy is set to grow by 8% over the next 12 months. So the opportunities are there. And I think that notwithstanding the fragile political position, with Sir Michael Somare basically being ill and acting Prime Minister and a cabinet reshuffle and an election in 12 months, I think that some of the senior leaders in PNG appreciate that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and it may not come their way again, and they won't squander it.
A question down the back, sir.
Josh Abdurrahman. Our mining investments in Africa borders on $24 billion. In 2005, Kevin Rudd promised to form an Australia-Africa Council. He has decided to dishonour that. John Howard, on the other hand, ignored Africa. What is your stance on that?
I think Africa cannot be ignored. Africa matters for Australia. I've spoken at a number of Africa-Australia trade forums in recent months. Indeed, at a recent meeting in Sydney, a number of ministers from Central Africa, from the Congo and Cameroon and other places were there. They knew about the mining tax and they knew about the carbon tax here, and they were presenting themselves as a safer sovereign risk than Australia. Seriously. So I think that there are immense opportunities for Australian mining and resource producers in Africa. They have clearly seen that those opportunities are there, and as you pointed out, are investing billions of dollars in Africa. I suspect, and I say this seriously, I suspect that with the advent of a carbon tax and the mining tax, more Australian explorers will be turning to Africa, without doubt. So on that basis, where Australian companies are operating and where Australian people are working, that means we need to have a presence in Africa. And I think that the coalition policy of turning west as well as east will encompass most certainly the east coast of Africa, where much of this mining and resource development is taking place. I come from Western Australia. It's not just a geographic location being on the Indian Ocean rim, it's a state of mind. And we really do think about Africa as a destination for Australian investment from the West, because we live and breathe it every day. So it will form one of our foreign policy priorities, but it certainly will not overtake our focus on our immediate region, which, as I've said on a number of occasions this evening, will be our main priority, our immediate neighbourhood and region.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Susan Merrill. I'm a journalist and I work in Papua New Guinea, so if I could take it back there, please. You talk about the LNG and the mining and whatever's going on there, and economically it's all looking wonderful. However, what no one is talking about is the very real human rights abuses that happen with their women. We're talking about 70% of women are victims of domestic violence. We're talking about horrific statistics on sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about a country that has laws that outlaw this. They have human rights rules that outlaw this. We're talking about a country that ignores them. How does an Australian government or an Australian opposition then deal with this country on a purely economic basis?
It's interesting, when I went up to the Southern Highlands with the project partners to see the LNG project, and I was talking to one of the representatives about the sheer logistics of developing a project in the remote mountainous areas of PNG, where everything has to be flown in or come in by helicopter. I mean, it just must be a nightmare. And I said to this representative from ExxonMobil, because they've obviously done LNG projects all over the world, I said, look, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being easy and 10 being really hard, how would you describe this project? And he said, oh, from the logistic location point of view, probably 2. In other words, relatively easy. He said, from the social and cultural point of view, a 9, about as tough as it gets. And you're there, you understand, better than most in this room, I would imagine, the civil unrest, the level of violence, the collapse of law and order in some areas. The issue of sexual violence was the subject of many discussions that I had in PNG. I met with the PNG Police Commissioner and a number of the police and talked about it. And I have to say, I was impressed by the Commissioner's commitment to, well, he said the right things, I can tell you. Said the right things, and some of the facilities that have been set up and some of the centres that have been focusing on domestic violence. When I said earlier that Australia needs to establish more ministerial level human rights dialogues, I believe Papua New Guinea is one country that we should target in that regard. We have human rights dialogues with Vietnam and China. I think that PNG would be a ripe candidate for that kind of dialogue, frank and open, and addressing the social issues that so beset PNG. That was why I made the comment about sport. Having seen a society so riven by conflict, I couldn't believe how they united to support Queensland for the State of Origin game. And it's not a flippant comment. It was above national pride.
Yes, but
It was, so I kept thinking there's got to be a way to harness their love of sport and their admiration for sporting heroes in a way that we try and, not so successfully, we try and do it in Australia as well, if we can somehow use it as a hook to a better understanding of what is acceptable and what is not. But in terms of the actual human rights issues, I think that we need to establish a formal dialogue so that our concerns can be discussed in an open and frank forum.
Okay, I'll take 2 more questions. Is there one more question? And 2.
My name is Bill Levenstrasser. I was wondering how long you think Australian military forces should be involved in Afghanistan?
I understand that the United States is looking at 2014 as a time for withdrawing troops. Now, it's not clear whether the Australian government sees that as the beginning of the drawdown of troops or the end, but clearly 2014 is a milestone in terms of the engagement in Afghanistan. I suspect many will assume that President Obama will start withdrawing troops well before that time, but 2014 is a milestone, and we'd certainly be looking to get more details from the government as to its understanding of what is actually going to occur in 2014. So that's the milestone that I think will be the trigger for a decision as to when troops should leave. I'll put it in that time frame.
Hi, my name is John Minchy. It's just a question in relation to the live cattle exports. And you mentioned the bundling of the Labor government in relation to that. How would the coalition government deal with that?
First, I would hope that a coalition minister who was advised on coming into that portfolio and indeed received a brief, as Minister Ludwig did, that there were real problems with some abattoirs in Indonesia, would have taken steps to prevent this becoming the issue that it did at that time. So I think that the warnings that the Minister apparently received should have been a red light flashing for some action to have been taken. Once the government knew that the program was going to air, as I understand it did sometime in advance, I would have been in touch with the Indonesian government to try and ascertain independently what the situation was in relation to some of these abattoirs and how widespread the abuses were. It seems that the government didn't do that, even though it had notice of the program. Upon the program going to air, I most certainly would have suspended the live cattle trade to the abattoirs that were found to be non-compliant. And the government did that. It initially suspended the live cattle export trade to those abattoirs, and the coalition supported that. We thought that was the appropriate response. I believe that in response to a very significant email campaign, the government reacted differently and imposed a total ban on all abattoirs, whether they were run by elders or Australian companies or by Indonesians, whether they were compliant or non-compliant. I thought that was an overreaction, and it was also grossly disrespectful to Indonesia not to warn them or consult with them before imposing a total ban, because many, many livelihoods are dependent upon the live cattle trade, not just in Australia but in Indonesia. It's a sort of challenge that should have been worked through between the Australian government and the Indonesian government in partnership, and that didn't occur. And I would hope that with a closer, deeper, stronger relationship with Indonesia, if challenges such as this arose, we would be able to do it in a way that didn't damage our relationship with them.
Thank you, Joy. I think that was a very exhaustive Q&A session, and I thank the Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition for allowing us to be able to ask those questions of her. I think it's important in this sort of forum. I mean, we hear sound grabs and sound bites in the media, but in this sort of forum, we really get a chance, I think, to hear to hear policy outline and to hear these fantastic conversations, and also as members of the Institute to be able to ask these sorts of questions. That's leading into my sales pitch, which is if you're not a member of the Institute of International Affairs, you need to be. And we're right on the beginning of our membership cycle now, so I encourage you to get a form on your way out. We have all sorts of benefits, Burgalow books, Sydney Morning Herald subscriptions, you name it, we've got it. But I would like to invite up also the other Vice President of the Council, Robert Pritchard, to give the formal vote of thanks to the Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my very great pleasure to propose a vote of thanks to the Honourable Deputy Leader, Julie Bishop. I particularly enjoyed, as I'm sure you would have, her emphasis on a number of issues which go very close to the charter of this institute and very close to the current concerns of this institute, particularly her emphasis on the importance of bilateral relations with our key partners, referring specifically to the United States, specifically to China, specifically to India, and specifically to PNG. You made a particular emphasis, Shadow Minister, on relations with our neighbours, and I do think that's so important that I think hits the nail on the head. The point is, we now live in an age of global interdependence like at no other time in world history, and this institute does believe that it's one of the key resources in Australia in aiding this international understanding. We have regular visits from China and counterpart organisations in other countries where we engage in confidential bilateral dialogue on the sort of issues you were addressing us about this evening, and we think that that complements what takes place at the official level. And it's of great comfort to us not only to know that we have political leaders who are sensitive to these issues, but we have a high quality officialdom in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which we hold in such high regard. Ms Bishop referred, of course, to the importance of aid, but at the same time she also emphasised the importance of trade, in addition to aid, giving people a hand up rather than just a hand out. She referred to a specific opposition initiative of the creation of a Minister for International Development as a supplement to the role of the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and that is of particular interest. She also referred to and emphasised particularly the importance of human rights, and I must say that went down well with me, and I'm sure with everyone else in the room. Finally, she referred to the importance of engaging with women leaders in the region, and I'd certainly hope that in future she will also be seen as one of the women leaders of our region. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join with me in expressing your appreciation.